special afternoon where we have a talk by Jeff Smith on a topic which is much discussed and debated in India. Jeff is a research fellow with the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, and he focuses on South Asia, a handful of South Asia India experts in Washington. His book Cold Peace was much read and discussed. I hope many of you found time to read that. His next book is coming out, I think, which is what his project is about. You have a copy?
I have one copy.
Oh, so we can show it off as a book launch. He'll come again when the book is when he has more copies. But I think this is the title of the book, as well as today's talk, where he'll focus on a few of the findings of this book, as well as some of the broader themes emerging out of this project. And we will have Rajeswari after that commenting on the book, the themes, as well as Jeff's interventions. So with that, let me ask Jeff to make his presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Raji, and thank you to ORF and Samir Saran. We've had a really wonderful history of cooperation with ORF over the years. Heritage Foundation does, and I did in my previous capacity at the American Foreign Policy Council, where I headed the Asian Studies program there. I moved to Heritage last year when my predecessor, Lisa Curtis, was brought to the National Security Council to be senior director for South Asia. So big shoes to fill at Heritage over the past year, but it's been a really great, really productive year, including a lot of cooperation with our friends here in India and with ORF. I would also like to thank the contributing authors to this book. I really mean it when I say that the greatest value that this book brings is in the relationships that my contributing authors helped to tease out. So the primary objective of this book was based on the basic assumption in the realist theory of international relations that the rise of a power, particularly a large power like China, creates a ripple effect. And throughout history, realists would say that the traditional response by other countries in the periphery, its neighbors and peers, is to adopt balancing strategies. And we'll get into that in a moment, but the design of the book was to ask author experts from 9 key Chinese neighbors to write dedicated chapters looking at their bilateral relationships with China. And of course, to look at to what degree are these countries balancing in the way that we would think they might be. But they're really 9 very rich chapters that explore India. Rajamohan and Sylvia Mishra wrote the India chapter. But India, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Burma. In these chapters, I think you'll find a great deal of information on these unique bilateral relationships that I think will be very valuable to people watching the region. My job, of course, was to edit these chapters, to provide some uniformity, to provide a template so that there's a cohesive narrative, and then to try and extrapolate out from them what does the environment look like? What does the Asian chessboard, how is it changing with China's rise? Are these countries balancing? If so, how much? At what intensity? Are they balancing at different intensities, toward different objectives? And what could change that calculation in the future? These were some of the big picture questions I approached going into this volume, and maybe I can share some observations with you today. But I encourage anyone really interested in the topic to get a copy of the book and dig into these chapters. So as I said, there's this theory in international relations, particularly in the realist school of thought, that when a country like China rises, that others in its periphery should adopt balancing strategies. Internal balancing, beefing up their military capabilities, their defensive capabilities, should they need to protect themselves from aggression. Their external balancing, are they making new friendships with other countries? Are they forging strategic partnerships with other countries in an attempt to mitigate the threat of coercion or aggression from this rising power? Internal and external balancing, much in the way that a victim of schoolyard bullying might enroll in martial arts classes, internal balancing, or might forge a friendship or partnership with other kids that are being bullied so they could present a united front against the bully. Nation states have traditionally acted in much the same way. So I think one of the key assumptions this book proceeds from is that much focus is on the US-China rivalry, but other Asian powers really do matter. This is not a bipolar world where all that matters is the US and China and everyone else is an innocent bystander just watching this superpower title fight. Here, I don't need to elaborate on India's potential demographic, economic potential, but most economists and demographers predict that the Indian economy, the Indian population, the Indian military capabilities will, by mid-century, have closed the gap with China's, if not exceeded it in some regards. So anyone who's looking at the long-term picture has to recognize that India is a very significant geopolitical player. Indonesia is projected to be the 4th or 8th largest economy by 2050, depending on the GDP measurement used, whether purchasing power parity or nominal. Vietnam and the Philippines are expected to grow faster in the next 20 years than any other major middle power economy. Australia and Japan, very advanced economies, very advanced militaries today, they're likely to remain very significant actors for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And America, there's a narrative that China is rising and America is declining. I find this statistic very interesting. In 1980, the United States accounted for 25.2% of the global economy. In 2016, it was 24.7%. We've dropped less than 1% as a share of the global economy in nominal terms. The United States is not declining and it is not going anywhere soon. Relatively speaking, there has been a transfer of money, power, and influence from the West to the rest, but the United States is not the one who's given up its principal share of the global economy. It's actually been Europe and Japan that have lost the biggest shares of the global economy. So we are moving toward a multipolar world where the United States still remains a very significant actor, but where other countries in China's periphery in the Indo-Pacific matter a great deal. So realist tradition will say countries in the periphery of a rising power will choose balancing or they'll choose bandwagoning. They'll either decide to become very close allies with this rising power, or they'll begin to internal and external balancing to hedge against aggression. But they say usually the countries choose balancing. They often don't choose bandwagoning. Why is that? 2 reasons. First, there's no insurance against aggression. There's no world policeman. There's nothing to say that a country A might be more powerful and might show good intentions now, but decides to change its mind in 5 years. There's no insurance. So it's still the Wild West. Even though we do have international institutions now, even though we do have globalization and economic interdependence, there still is no force with a monopoly on the use of force on the international stage. So there's no insurance. And the second is intentions are impossible to definitively discern. A country that seems like it could be our friend today could change tomorrow. So we have to have some kind of protection. So the very rising of a power, the very fact that it's powerful, creates insecurity, which is why states often choose balancing not just against direct and immediate threats, but against potential threats. It's not always the case, and America actually provides, in my opinion, the best contemporary example. America is very powerful compared to other states, rose very quickly in the 20th century, yet that's a case where we did not see a lot of countries across the world saying, wait a minute, we need to prepare against aggression. The United States could invade at any time. We did not see a tremendous amount of balancing activity. So you can be a rising power, you can be a powerful power, and you can assuage the concerns of others, but that is more of a rare case. That traditionally has not happened. And with China, we have not seen that sort of same type of assurance from other countries. So if we take this framework that China is rising and its neighbors and peers should be balancing, and we go to 2007 and ask, is that happening? The answer was pretty much no. The narrative surrounding China's peaceful rise was still pretty prominent. There was disaffection with the United States leadership after the invasion of Iraq during the George W. Bush administration. China seemed to be a peacefully rising alternative in some corners of Asia. Most of the capitals in the Indo-Pacific were either appeased or distracted or coerced or unmotivated to adopt real balancing activity. In 2007, scholar David Kang said, East Asian public opinion about China is generally positive and reflects little of the fear hypothesized in the pessimistic literature. East Asian states are not engaged in military balancing of China. No state other than Taiwan fears the Chinese use of force against it. That began to change the following year. There's generally a broad consensus among China watchers that in 2008 something changed, and we've seen a much more assertive, much more aggressive Chinese foreign policy since 2008. Some of this can be attributed to domestic internal politics behind the shadowy cloak of Chinese politics that we probably will never get a particularly clear answer on. But we do know 2008 was the year of the Beijing Olympics, which motivated Chinese nationalism, made the Chinese population proud, but also to some degree resentful, particularly when the West tried to boycott the Olympics over human rights issues and violations, but including a crackdown in Tibet. Tibet, some people forget, earlier in 2008 had one of the worst bouts of domestic unrest it had seen in many years, on, I believe, the 49th anniversary of the uprising in Tibet in the 1950s. So that had China feeling a bit more insecure in Tibet. That provided some resentment surrounding the Olympics. 2008 was also the year that a man by the name of Xi Jinping was elevated to vice president and ironically was given duties for managing the Olympics. So he was intimately tied into that and the Tibet crisis in some ways. But by far, I think scholars believe the most important thing that happened in 2008 was the global financial crisis. And many in Beijing interpreted, in my opinion, misinterpreted that event as a seminal moment in history. It was the signal of America, the beginning of America's decline and the beginning of China's coming out party on the world stage. And I think they frankly overestimated Beijing's resilience, the resilience of the economy, the resilience of its soft power and messaging, and underestimated the resilience of the U.S. I think some people believed there that the U.S., this was the beginning of a terminal economic decline, and that simply was not the case. But there was a psychological shift in China that this policy of hide and bide, there was no reason to hide anymore. We're here, we're on the world stage, it's time to assert our rights. Others have taken advantage of us for too long. So I won't go into great detail, but since 2008, we did begin to see rising signs of Chinese assertiveness all across its borders, particularly in the maritime arena in the South China Sea, the artificial island building, also along the disputed border with India. There were several incidents, most recently in Doklam Plateau last year, but beginning also earlier in 2013 and 2014, major episodes. Tensions with the U.S. over freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea and over a number of issues, including cyber theft, cybersecurity. I don't think it's a stretch to say that over the past 10 years, Chinese foreign policy has grown more assertive, which has changed the landscape. So did this assertive Chinese policy prompt a round of balancing in the Indo-Pacific, which is sort of the core question of the book? And the answer is yes, but it's complicated. Indo-Pacific capitals are balancing, but they're doing so at different intensities and toward different objectives. At a macro level, it's very clear to see evidence of internal balancing. Defense spending has been rising faster in Asia than in any other region of the world for some time. A lot of this spending is going toward advanced military platforms like submarines, platforms that suggest preparation for conventional conflict with a larger military power. This despite largely the absence of major interstate conflicts in Asia. So Asia has been actually quite peaceful by historical terms, yet defense spending has been rising faster than any other region. That should tell you something. The pace of new exercises, new strategic partnerships, what we call external balancing, has also been increasing significantly. New military exercises, and India has been a big part of this. Just over the past 10 years, if you look at the number of military exercises India is doing with the US, with Japan, the number of trilaterals that have been formed, the Quad, which was formed and then dissolved and now has reformed, the Malabar exercises, just the sheer number of new strategic partnerships and joint vision statements and signals of greater cooperation and integration, the pace of that has significantly quickened, all of which at least indirectly suggests some level of anxiety about China. Many of these states, of course, have been improving cooperation with the U.S., and I could cite the many ways in which U.S. defense cooperation with these Indo-Pacific capitals has been picking up over the past 10 years. That's sort of the first macro picture. But then you look at the landscape and you say, okay, you say they're balancing, but man, there sure seems like there's a lot of engagement with China too. Everybody's engaging with China. Everybody wants Chinese money. China is the biggest trading partner of every member of the Quad by some statistics. So even the U.S. is trading with China. Australia, India, Japan, everybody's engaging with China. How could you say they're balancing? And to some degree, my conclusion is that there has been underbalancing. Maybe these countries, we've been balancing less than theory or history or logic would dictate. There's been more engagement and less balance. Why is that? A few things I identified. One, free riding off the U.S. Why should we spend limited resources on balancing and risk provoking China's ire if the United States is going to take care of security for us, if any conflict is going to invite U.S. involvement anyway? This creates a bit of a paradox for American policymakers. See, the U.S. likes the fact that some Indo-Pacific countries are beginning to take more responsibility for their security, are beginning to spend more on defense and acquire more advanced platforms. But it also doesn't want regional countries free riding off of it. But it also needs to provide a level of assurance that they believe the U.S. will become involved if needed, if there is a conflict. So it's a very it's a needle that the U.S. has to thread while providing assurance without retarding the impetus among regional countries to build up their own defenses. ASEAN culture. It's not just ASEAN, but there is what seems like an ingrained aversion to taking provocative or controversial stances in public, to directly criticizing China, even when we have major reservations that we voice frequently in private, to talking about balancing. Nobody says, well, we're doing this because we're balancing against China's rise. They just do it quietly and everybody understands what they're doing. But there is this aversion to being seen as openly confrontational, which I think has contributed some to underbalancing. This one is probably going to be a bit more controversial. But the nature of China and China's rise and the threat China poses, I believe, have contributed to underbalancing, historically speaking. However concerned you may be about China, and I've been among the fiercer critics in Washington, it's important to recognize what it's not. It is not Nazi Germany. It is not Imperial Japan. China's neighbors have very serious, very real concerns about China, but very few of them, perhaps save Taiwan, fear that Chinese tanks are going to come steamrolling over the border to invade them. They don't fear that China is about to launch a genocide against a large group of people. China has major territorial disputes, very active territorial disputes, including with India. But the geographic scope of its claims are relatively well defined. We know what China claims and what it wants. Even if those claims are themselves illegal, ambiguous, undefined, there are few people who think that China wants to invade and take over all of Japan, or China wants to seize all of India for its own. So we have it's a slightly more limited set of challenges and threats. Very, very serious, but not for many Indo-Pacific capitals, Malaysia or Indonesia, an existential threat. They're balancing more to preserve their sovereignty and autonomy rather than their survival or their existence, which leads to a bit more, a less determined form of balancing. China is just wielding more subtle elements of power and influence than the USSR did, than Nazi Germany did. Where they wanted to fill these voids with radical revolutionaries, China wants submission. China just wants others to fall in line with the Chinese-led regional order. So it's a different challenge, and I think the way I put it is the depth of region-wide threat perceptions don't match the width. There are real concerns across the broad Indo-Pacific map, but they're not as deep as concerns had been in the past. So what we did find is that ASEAN, most of ASEAN, are doing something that we would call soft balancing or even institutional balancing. They are not quite as concerned as the hard balancers. They're taking more modest steps to improve their defensive capabilities. They're forging external partnerships at a more modest rate. And their threat perceptions are a bit more modest than what I would call the hard balancers. ASEAN states, this is directly from the book, prefer a regional order that's multipolar in nature, one in which the Quad remains actively engaged and serves as a geopolitical and economic counterweight to China's growing power and influence. For ASEAN, encouraging the Quad to assume more active and consistent roles in regional affairs offers a less provocative means of achieving a relative balance of power than proactively seeking to limit or diminish China's power and influence. Yet ASEAN's willingness to translate their concerns about China into proactive balancing remains limited. They will continue taking modest steps to strengthen their military capabilities and forge new partnerships, but will feel constrained by geographic realities and economic imperatives. Some, like Vietnam, may pursue more independent foreign policies and more vigorous balancing initiatives in the years ahead, potentially drawing closer to the Quad. But absent a major provocation from China that fundamentally alters region-wide threat perceptions, the relative aloofness of Indonesia, Malaysia, and others is likely to endure, ironically reflecting the disposition of their broader publics, surprisingly unaware of or disinterested in the geopolitical great game underway. Now, it is important to note that the calculus of these soft balancers, first of all, they differ very much in their intensity. Vietnam is balancing at a much more active rate than Malaysia is. But for each of them, their calculus could change, and in each chapter, the authors were asked to identify what is it that China might do that would change your calculus. And for some of them, it was militarizing Scarborough Shoal. For some of them, it was China using force against another member state of ASEAN or drilling for oil in disputed territory. But it's important to note that this calculation could change. But for now, they're more focused on soft balancing or institutional balancing, which is creating a set of rules. You hear a lot about the rules-based order. That's what ASEAN wants the US and Japan and Australia and others to do, is create a rules-based framework that doesn't contain China, but constrains its ability and capacity for misbehavior. Now, the Quad, on the other hand, has been engaging in more vigorous balancing, the US, Japan, and India, and Australia. And to me, these are four far more consequential powers. If you look at the combined military and economic weight of just the US, Japan, and India, it far outstrips all of ASEAN put together. So what happens with India and Japan and the US matters a great deal more than what's happening with ASEAN, in my opinion. And they're balancing more in internal and external balancing ways with military capabilities and partnerships like the Quad, but also beginning to limit engagement with China. And that's one of the things I identified, the difference between moving from soft balancing to hard balancing is, are you also willing to limit engagement for fear of empowering your potential rival? It begins to create a contradiction if you say country X is my principal rival and poses a threat to me, but I'm going to continue empowering them and doing trade with them and granting them access to my technology and my economy and so forth. And what we have seen just recently is, in the past year or two, is a lot more scrutiny being placed on Chinese investments, a lot more scrutiny on the Belt and Road Initiative. In part, these are manifestations of harder forms of balancing, and that's one thing I focus on here is that really, if we look at it, it happened in two waves. 2008 onward, what I spoke about, everyone, including ASEAN and the others, saw this uptick in Chinese assertiveness and activity along its borders, particularly in the South China Sea. And that began to prompt some balancing. What we're seeing since 2016 is another wave, a new wave of concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative, about Chinese sharp power, about investments in sensitive infrastructure, about Chinese plans at Colombo and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, about extraditions of Chinese nationals from other countries, about academic freedom, about intervention into the domestic affairs of others, which is something that China has always said it outright rejects, more bullying, more illegal donations to politicians, more manifestations of sharp power. And I think this is beginning to spark a new wave of concerns, not just among the Quad, but among ASEAN and others. And I've already heard myself speak long enough. I'd much prefer to open this up to Q&A and a back and forth, but I'll close with just one or two quotes from the book. As the carrots for those in China's good graces have grown larger, the sticks deployed against countries that displease Beijing are getting sharper and being wielded more freely with each passing year. China's red lines are getting thicker and encasing new issues. The Quad has begun to appeal to ASEAN and capitals further afield to recognize the threat posed not just by Chinese warships and ballistic missiles, but by debt traps and dependence. A clear picture has begun to emerge of the costs accompanying a Chinese-led order. To date, regional capitals have proven willing to trade a degree of autonomy for material benefit, but few seem comfortable granting the Chinese Communist Party a veto over their foreign and economic policies. For all the differences between ASEAN, the Quad, and others on the security challenges posed by China's rise, this phenomenon is creating an expanding zone of common ground. Nearly every regional capital hopes to preserve their autonomy and sovereignty in a rules-based order free from Chinese hegemony. That's one area where I do believe there is growing common ground among the Quad, among ASEAN, among the hard and soft balancers, and among every capital in China's periphery. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and comments and observations on your remarks, because just in the last year we have seen this move from Doklam to Wuhan to now just last week Chinese suggesting that it's imperative for India and China to work together against the unilateral instincts of the Trump administration. There's been a long sort of a trajectory for Sino-Indian relations just in the last 1 year itself, feeding on some of the themes that you highlighted in terms of how India is positioning itself in concert, sometimes alone, sometimes in concert with other actors. So I think it's a fascinating area which hopefully we'll discuss in great detail. Before that, Raji, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, Jeff. I think it's always a pleasure reading your work, and you bring in a lot of sense of clarity in your writings, and I look forward to reading your the new book on the Asia's quest for balance. I think there is no better time to discuss this particular topic than today. Clearly, rise of China has created huge uncertainties, strategic uncertainties, because I think China poses itself as a longer-term strategic problem in that sense. And therefore, it is not Pakistan. Pakistan is more of a tactical problem. But I think China, in that sense, is a longer-term problem. So how do you actually get around to dealing with China? Nobody is talking about containing China, but at the same time, how do you make China play by the rules of the road? How do you make China a more responsible stakeholder and so on and so forth, come up with more acceptable behavior or responsible behavior and so on and so forth. So I think that's the basic point about all the discussions and the debates and the number of books that are coming out. It's all looking at this particular aspect. And Harsh said India and China, there are statements that come out and saying that India and China should work together and so on and so forth. Chindia formulation, these are formulations that have been fairly, there are some analysts and some school of thinkers will be excited about how China and India can work together and so on and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, I think if you ask most of the neighbors, they will go by what Chinese actions on the ground are rather than the rhetoric, because there's a huge gap between the Chinese rhetoric and the actions on the ground. And I think that's where, again, why countries, for the very fact that the second time there's a Quad coming up together, I think that itself says a lot about a decade later how things are still panning out, and therefore the countries in the region, at least the major powers, have felt the need to come together to do this kind of a balancing act in a sense, and kind of things. But again, I think I agree with Jeff's most of the points that he has raised. One of the points that he talked about is, for instance, when he look at the China is not going to conquer other countries and kind of things, whether it is Japan or walking into Japan, even Taiwan, they're not going to do it. But what do you do about the salami slicing tactics that China has been adopting, which actually cuts into the whole issue of territorial integrity in a sense? And where does that point and how does that get addressed in any of our strategies? I think that's something that a lot of the countries, especially with those China has territorial and sovereignty-related issues, are concerned about. But I want to talk about a couple of other issues also. One is, of course, Indo-Pacific strategy has come to be more or less accepted by all states in the region, both in the larger East Asian region, but also Southeast Asian region. There are, of course, difference in the degree of acceptance and acceptability within each of their governments. ASEAN, for instance, is still not entirely convinced that they can, because I think the very fact that it's touted or seen as an anti-China thing is somewhat seen as a problem. And I think they would like a slightly different rationale to be post out there. I think that's something that could bring about greater sense of acceptance from some of these Southeast Asian countries, for instance. But ASEAN itself has a bigger problem. The minute some of the sovereignty and territorial issues were brought in, you have seen a much more fractured ASEAN. ASEAN was a good model for economic integration, regional economic integration. They were a lot successful, but when it comes to political and strategic issues, that they have had limited success. So in a sense, ASEAN itself, and I think that's where again the question for Indo-Pacific countries, for instance, some of the countries within ASEAN, some of the big powers like Singapore, Malaysia, are trying to do a pushback, resist the Chinese pressure. And what can the Indo-Pacific countries do to kind of strengthen their capacity to push back on China even more effectively, more in an efficient manner? So one of the areas, for instance, is capacity building, economic and trade linkages. But more importantly, I would say the regional connectivity infrastructure project, these are important for them, because I think these are the tools that China has used to penetrate or infiltrate into these countries, these regions in a sense. So you need to use those, because the Indo-Pacific countries have to provide alternate options to these countries if they have to be able to effectively resist the Chinese pressure. So I think that there lies a huge amount of huge opportunity for the Indo-Pacific countries. But again, how far we have done successfully in addressing these issues is a question. I'll give you one example. Okay, this is not a country that is pushing back on China. I'll give you the case of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has gone on this loan they have run into issues with the repayment issues, and they have the Hambantota port on a 99-year lease with China. But the fact is that as the next year, 2019 repayment cycle is coming up, Sri Lanka has actually gone back to China asking for fresh infusion of cash. Why is it that the Indo-Pacific countries were not able to do anything about it? Some of the larger Indo-Pacific countries should have been able to offer some assistance, offer alternative options to Sri Lanka, and we have not done that. So I think while we talk about the strategy and the politics about the Indo-Pacific concept, I think there also has to be something more substantial, something more meaty about for these countries, whether it is Sri Lanka, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and in other parts for these countries to come out of the China clutch, so to say, or the Chinese way. So I think that's one set of issues that we need to look at. Second, I think there are also a whole lot of lack of clarity about what the Indo-Pacific concept is all about, the geographical construct itself. So I think we have gone around from whether it is from what is the there has not been a complete understanding. For instance, I think Australia has a very different conceptual idea on Indo-Pacific than India, Japan, or even France and the US. I think so. Those issues, I don't see it as a big problem, but I think many policy analysts, policymakers do think there has to be greater understanding and alignment before they can actually make the Indo-Pacific construct a lot more real in a sense. But I think that's going to be a problem in a sense. And we have also, I think there have been questions about whether we should bring in the continental Asia into the Indo-Pacific concept, the South Asia into the concept or not. I think these are the questions that we have debated. But again, I don't think the short answer is no, because that's going to divert from the big strategic focus if we do that. And second, much of South Asia is also already aligned with China more than the other way. So in a sense, bringing South Asia or the continental Asia does not bring it. The Indo-Pacific itself is the alignment of the two maritime spaces, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So I think that strategic logic has to be kept in mind. But if we can't wait for all the strategic alignment of these ideas, whether in terms of geographical concept or the theoretical understanding, to happen before we start having. So one of the first requirement in that sense to make it more real is also to have more structured dialogues among the Indo-Pacific countries. At least all the major Indo-Pacific countries, the larger Indo-Pacific countries, need to have a more periodic structured dialogues to also understand and appreciate what every country doesn't have to be involved in every part of the Indo-Pacific region. So there can be some division of labor, some sort of burden sharing among the Indo-Pacific countries in terms of responding to some of the major natural disasters in Southeast Asia, for instance. Maybe Australia will come into play. Australia and India can coordinate in certain areas, and so on and so forth. So I think the fact that we haven't had too many of these kind of strategic dialogues and conversations among the larger Indo-Pacific countries itself is one part of the problem. But I think I do see a larger problem in that sense, and I think that stems from India, for instance. India, for instance, have time and again we have gone back and forth between endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept to sometimes reassuring to China, saying that, oh, we are not ganging against you, we are with you. Indo-Pacific is an inclusive concept. Look at Modi's Shangri-La speech. Again, it was one of those speeches that included every possible idea under that. So he did not use that opportunity to kind of set out the agenda, set out the priorities in India's foreign policy. So I think that also sends a wrong signal in a sense. And again, Wuhan has happened. Again, so there is question about where is India now? Was it more tactical kind of a move, or was it more strategic move from moving towards China and so on and so forth? And some of the analysts in India talk about a multi-alignment. Again, I don't know that concept, and I don't think I am particularly excited about that concept. Multi-alignment essentially meaning that you're going to put your foot in 10 different shapes, and you're going to be essentially, when there's a crisis, you're going to be sinking right in the middle of the sea. So that's what is going to happen. You need to have a clear sense of what your foreign policy priorities are, what your strategic national security priorities are, and accordingly you need to go about. And second, one more final point I wanted to talk about. So I think that is the last point I wanted to talk about. The whole India's effort to sometimes balance, but sometimes to reassure China, has sent mixed signals to a lot of different people, a lot of different countries, and it's not very clear. The very final point: should we expand the Indo-Pacific concept beyond the region? And I think there is a need to do that, especially countries like Canada and also countries like France have been already endorsing the concept. And I think there is a need for these countries also to be brought on board because there is merit in doing that. France, especially when you look at the kind of maritime space that it occupies in the Indo-Pacific region, I think it makes perfect sense to endorse and bring in other countries as much as possible to give more teeth to the Indo-Pacific concept and balance China in a more effective manner. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to, but I think all the questions should go to Jeff more or less. Thank you.
Maybe one or two comments on your brief. Since I did a book on China-India, I've been following this relationship for a long time, and I have found the narrative surrounding China-India relations quite peculiar over the past year. People keep telling me, well, don't you see India is now balancing away from the U.S. and back toward China? Didn't you see the Wuhan summit? Didn't you see Modi's Shangri-La dialogue speech? Well, of course I did. What major package deal came out of the Wuhan summit? What was the huge tangible substance that came out of that? Well, nothing. Well, what was the minor agreement that they made? What border differences did they resolve? What issues were put on the table? Well, none. So two leaders met each other, as they do often annually, and that's about it. Now, what that was, in my opinion, was in the ebb and flow of China-India relations, the two countries, the two leaders had realized that in 2017, particularly with the Doklam crisis, they had reached something of a nadir, and it was getting to a dangerous point, and they both had an interest in bringing the relationship back to a more manageable state. That's fine. That's good for stability in bilateral relations. How anyone interpreted that as a shift away from the United States and towards some new alignment with China is beyond me. Even the Shangri-La dialogue speech, did you see that speech, Jeff? Yeah, I saw it. Every tenet that Prime Minister Modi laid out as his vision for the Indo-Pacific aligned almost perfectly with the tenets that the U.S. has laid out for the Indo-Pacific: freedom of navigation, respect for sovereignty, respect for international law, freedom of commerce, democratic principles. I mean, they were in almost lockstep. And Prime Minister Modi, I thought, had a very important statement that the future of this region belongs to those who reside here and also others who have a stake in it. Now, China and others have often tried to say this region is for Asia's for Asians. Only the powers that live here, the future belongs to us. Prime Minister Modi was, I think, in a very clever way saying there are other regional powers who also have direct interests and stakes here. So it seems to me you can read these speeches in many different ways. Somebody said, well, you know what, Prime Minister Modi didn't mention the Quad, so India must be against it. I don't know if President Trump has ever mentioned the Quad. That's not something that a president needs to speak about or a prime minister needs to speak about for it to be real and tangible. Well, Prime Minister Modi didn't criticize China. How many speeches have Prime Minister Modi given where he directly said China is a bad player? Never. Once or twice on the campaign trail, indirect references, but this isn't the nature of Asian leadership politics. You don't stand at a podium and directly criticize one another. It doesn't mean India's aligning toward China again. Would we have preferred stronger statements on some things? Sure. But I'm not one to sort of read too much into what's happened over the past year, nor am I fearful that for some reason the United States has lost India or India's entire foreign policy trajectory has changed. The Indo-Pacific, just a point of clarity because there's been so much discussion about it. What is the Indo-Pacific? What does it mean? How is it different from the free and open Indo-Pacific? The idea of an Indo-Pacific has been around a long time, but its contemporary use was arguably traces back to the mid-2000s. Prime Minister Abe in Japan promoted this idea of a confluence of the two seas. And part of the problem with the Indo-Pacific is that it's two separate visions, as Raji alluded to. There's a geographic component to it, which says the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, particularly the Western Pacific, should be looked at. First of all, the importance of the maritime arena is rising, and the connections between what happens overland and the maritime arena is rising. And the connections between these two waterways are rising. And it's increasingly one shared geopolitical space. What happens in the Western Pacific and East Asia impacts what happens in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia. So it's better for us to start looking this as one space, not least because China's interests and influence are pushing west with the Belt and Road Initiative. India's interests and influence are pushing east with Act East and other developments. The maritime arena is both increasingly important as a conduit for trade between the Middle East and energy consumers in India and East Asia, but also for competition. The Chinese Navy, which really had no role in the Indian Ocean over a decade ago, has now become a very regular actor in the Indian Ocean, has its first overseas logistics base now in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is becoming an arena for competition in a way it wasn't over 10 years ago. So that's the geographic part of the Indo-Pacific, geographic geopolitical construct. Prime Minister Abe, in his original vision, saw not only this binding of the regions, but had a vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. So not only is this one space, but this is one space under threat from new challenges that we need to keep free and prosperous, democratically free to the degree we can, economically free, open to freedom of navigation. So in the years after Abe promoted this vision, the geographic construct part of it kind of took hold. In Australia's 2011 white paper, we saw a lot of references to the Indo-Pacific. Hillary Clinton mentioned the Indo-Pacific in 2011. You saw U.S. Pacific Command last year was renamed Indo-PACOM to show that its geographic areas of responsibility have changed. But we've also seen just in the last year or two the free and open part come back to the Indo-Pacific. And what you really saw around 2015, amid new challenges from China, was a lot more emphasis on the rules-based order. China is challenging the rules-based order, this set of rules and principles that have governed the region and really facilitated an era of great prosperity and lack of conflict, are under new challenges and new threats, not least from a rising China. So we need to reinforce those rules and the pillars and the institutions. And at least in the U.S., that emphasis on the rules-based order has been replaced by this free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which is essentially, the two are synonymous. It is a vision for the rules-based order.
Thank you. Let me open this floor for your questions, comments, or observations.
Thank you. I think, Jeff, in your last 2 points, you brought out a lot more, but I still want to get more out of you. This, personally, I can't see the reset post-Wuhan, post-Sochi, between India and China, meaning nothing has happened on the ground besides the bland statement made by Wang Yi and others from China, because the CPEC problem is there, BRI is there, energy is there. I can go on. I hope there is a reset. Engagement will continue, but not on Chinese terms. That's point one. Number two, in your entire, of course, your book is balanced. You've encompassed everything under the word balance. I mean, as far as you're concerned, everybody is balancing to a greater degree, to a lesser degree, maybe to a normative degree. I don't understand that because there are 2 or 3 other concepts. Counter, you've used the word counterweight as far as Quad is concerned. I also don't agree there, not because India doesn't agree. We are going slow with Quad. It's low key. That's why Modi didn't mention it in the Shangri-La dialogue. So the Quad, I think the US should not jump to too many conclusions. And this word counterweight, in my view, is far too strong. You might like to review that. You haven't mentioned a very important country in this region called Pakistan. I mean, they're the cause of the instability and volatility that's taking place here. You seem to have bypassed them. In fact, the US, their policy now acknowledges what they're up to and all these restrictions are coming about. So you bypassed it. You might like to mention my very last point, with which I again disagree with you. You talked of the US propounding multipolarity. In fact, from what we've heard of Trump, there's no multipolarity, there is no multilateralism. He's talking of protectionism, isolationism. So this is not quite gelling with the concept that you're talking of balance. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, can we take a few?
Oh, sure.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. In relation to your concept of balancing, what about regional powers using the conflict, diplomatic, economic, whatever, between the US and China to balance those two powers itself? For instance, here in this region, the local economic and military superpower India is having Nepal, Sri Lanka, various other countries using China to balance out against India. The Philippines is using China to balance out against the US. In the Pacific, the local superpower Australia is seeing the Pacific Islands using China to balance out against Australia. And also, putting on my former trade negotiators hat on, I can't help but ask you for your commentary on the formerly US-led TPP, which was designed to ensure all those rules stayed in place in spite of China's rise, posited against the Chinese-led RCEP as a possible alternative. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Jeff. Just wanted to ask you about policy that has been there in the US administration in the last 10 years. You just alluded to the fact that a lot has changed in the last 10 years, given China has become an active player. But there was this rebalancing strategy, then there was a hedging strategy that came around. There's a lot of focus also in the current administration about Iran and North Korea. So how does that one put US in perspective into all this? Because they have been very inconsistent. Other than the phone-ops that have gone on in the South China Sea, I would say US policy in Asia has been very inconsistent in the last 10 years. So how does the next step go about in revising that?
Well, I'd just ask you to actually tease that, because I think it's a good question, but what exactly about U.S. policy has been, not the naming of it. That's,
So there was in the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a policy that there would be a rebalancing towards Asia, where there would be more assets be deployed in the Western Pacific. But then the US got preoccupied with conflicts in the Middle East. Then again, in the Trump administration, there was a feeling that Asia is again going to be on the horizon, very importantly in respect to China. But then again, we see North Korea and the Korean Peninsula issue being more important to the Trump administration rather than issues in the South China Sea in specific. And also at this point in time, when you realize, at least in the Middle East as well, rather than solving already things that are under conflict, the new dynamic of the Iran nuclear deal opened up. And not to even mention, if you're talking about Asia, Russia is also a big player in the region. So this inconsistency of where you see multiple administrations come out with an Asia first or a more important Asia policy when it comes to the maritime domain, just gets sidetracked by other foreign policy engagements. And then you just have something on the more vague lines of free and open Indo-Pacific rather than a concerted effort.
I think
Jeff,
that's.
I think this is good enough, but I also sort of wanted to add on to what Tony was saying earlier, and I think one of the points one of the things when you look at an interaction, say, between India and America or any country in your book you can take and you look at that interaction, that is, America is such a big factor, of course, in the sense of how you're responding to that. And one of the issues that has been very consistent about American policy is also, from our perspective, inconsistency. That, look, when Obama administration came to office, there was this big hoo-ha about G2. And then suddenly it died off, and then Obama administration started the pivot, strategic rebalance to Asia Pacific, and then the concern was that nothing much was happening on the ground. It was all in the papers. And then when Mr. Trump came to office, initially there was a sense, okay, there's a possibility Mr. Trump being transactional, he can have a deal with the Chinese. I mean, there is a larger story that perhaps when you, as an academic, when you look back, you can tell about the trajectory of American foreign policy always being consistent, strong, balancing China. But I think if you are a smaller country in Asia, and if you're looking America carefully, you have to also navigate these various policy postures, which I think add to some of the complex dynamic that we witness in Asia, that it is not so simple to balance. It's not easy to balance because you have America itself changing its position on a number of factors. So why would you balance against China if America itself is starting from various points? It's always very easy, very tempting for Americans, section of the American establishment, for example, to say, well, I'm a great power, there is a great power in Asia rising, why don't we have a compact with them? in terms of managing Asia. So I think that adds an element of uncertainty to the responses of Asian powers or Asian smaller countries, which also adds another layer to this discourse in some ways. So it would be interesting to have your views on that. But yeah, you have a rich enough set of.
Yes, more than enough to chew on. I think it's a fair point. I think if I were sitting in a smaller Indo-Pacific capital, that I would have some questions about where this administration stands on a particular issue, on trade policy. I think there's a case to be made that U.S. position there has shifted on TPP. On some of the trade actions being taken by this administration, the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, has opposed the tariffs that have been imposed. There are inconsistencies in U.S. policy. The U.S. is a democracy, and we vote for different political leaders at times that have different priorities and objectives. And the leadership that was voted in the last time said from the start that they wanted to withdraw from the Iran deal. So there were consequences to that election. The leader also said he would withdraw from TPP. The irony, of course, is that both presidential candidates firmly committed to withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I often hear people say, well, Hillary didn't really mean it. She just told voters that she was going to withdraw. I don't buy that. That's not good enough for me. But it reflected a reality that I may or may not agree with, that American voters have been getting discontented. They feel that they've been getting a bad deal from free trade. That may be true, that may not be true, but it does reflect discontent within the country. But it also creates challenges for America promoting a vision for a free and open regional order, particularly a regional economic order. And we have yet to promote a comprehensive economic vision of the kind that we would have found with the TPP. We've instead reverted to promoting bilateral trade deals, which, to this administration's credit, has made some progress in signing some trade deals. But many of us would like to see a much more comprehensive vision for the region, for regional economic strategy. So that is one change that I can understand why it gave regional capitals pause. I personally didn't see a big change in the rebalance. I didn't see the Obama administration announce that we were shifting all these resources and attention to Asia, and then suddenly that cut off. In fact, what the administration announced, that it wanted 60% of forces allocated to Asia, has happened. And the Trump administration, followed through on and has remained consistent with many of the plans put in place under the Obama administration to transfer some of our most advanced military assets to the Indo-Pacific, to the Asia-Pacific. So that's happened, and it is happening, and it's continuing to happen. And while you do see some hedging or some policy changes, I think, on specific issues, I also think that America's general approach to the region and broad support for basic pillars that have undergirded the regional security environment remain unchanged. And in our relationship with China, what has sort of come to the forefront and become a key fault line is freedom of navigation. And I hear a lot of discussion about the South China Sea and what America has allowed China to do in the South China Sea, or America has failed in the. America has one articulated national interest in the South China Sea, and that is our naval warships and our aircraft, and all of our ships and aircraft can go in international waters, as they have always done. And we will not concede to any attempt by China to impede our freedom of navigation. And that's something we've been consistent with. That's something this administration has actually begun doing more of. And it's somewhere where I fear that there's the greatest potential for miscalculation or a conflict, frankly. In 2016, this problem has been getting worse, not better. In late 2016, the Chinese Navy seized a U.S. Navy drone in international waters, not even in the 9-dash line, beyond even China's most expansive claim over the entire South China Sea, they just stole a drone out of the water, inspected it, and gave it back when they wanted to. Just last week, or in the past 2 weeks, a U.S. Surveillance ship was confronted by a Chinese destroyer, which came within 45 meters of the bow. Very, very dangerous and provocative naval maneuver. So this problem, in my opinion, is getting worse, and it's something that in our bilateral relationship, away from this balancing geopolitics, is an issue that we in the U.S. have to manage, but one that we've been very consistent on over time. There was so much to cover in these questions. Pakistan was not covered in my talk. You are correct, because it's not a chapter in the book, because I wanted to find out which countries were balancing. And Pakistan is one of the only, if not maybe the only case of a country foregoing almost all types of balancing for full-blown engagement, maybe even bandwagoning or alliance. I mean, one of China's few countries that would consider themselves true friends of China. So it simply just didn't fall within this rubric or the framework of this scope. It's Pakistan's importance to China, the importance to China-India relations, huge deal. I mean, we could talk for a long time about that, but that just didn't happen to fall in the scope of this study. Smaller states are indeed balancing, using China to do their own balancing. I think it was a very appropriate question, and maybe the most appropriate example is that if you talk to folks in this region, in Sri Lanka or Nepal, they saw China as a way to balance against what they see as the regional hegemon, which is India. Not because they prefer China to India, it's not really the case, but because they prefer having options. They don't want to be wholly dependent on or bullied by one big power in the region. So for China is a way for them to achieve balance. Now what they're finding is, at first it seemed great. China comes in, now we have an alternative to India. We have a country that's not going to lecture us about human rights. It's not going to make us reform our economy in order to get loans. It's a win-win at very little cost. But what they are finding is, it's not that there's no strings attached when it comes to China, it's that there's a very different set of strings, monetary and non-monetary strings, and that there's real costs to doing business with China as well, which is why you've seen a backlash, not just in Sri Lanka, not just in Malaysia, in parts of Africa, in Europe, in Pakistan. Pakistan has come back to China and said, we're sorry. Even before the new government came in, this happened more now, but even months ago, saying, hold on a second, this isn't going to cut it. We're not going to use the Chinese currency in the Gwadar Free Trade Zone. We're not going to permit these terms. We got to take this project out of CPEC. You know, this is only going to benefit Chinese firms. You're using Chinese workers, Chinese raw materials, Chinese banks. The remittances are getting expatriated to China. Is this really in our best interest? With the new government, you've seen even more questioning of CPEC, and now talk of being downgraded significantly. So there are reservations even in China's closest friendships, and recognition of some of the costs that can accompany this. So, okay.
Chair. Jeff, I was just looking at the whole discourse that you put in is the theoretical framework of realist. But if I see from China's perspective and make it as a constructive approach, because China as a large power, as a power which wants to be a leader in the region, definitely understands the kind of threat perceptions other small states or middle powers are feeling in the region, which was quite visible with the China threat theory, which was at height. And probably what China's option was to engage all these countries in a more constructive manner, even forming alliances, right? Which US has already done. Looking at that, how would you see China, trying to balance with other powers rather than other powers balancing themselves against China? My question is just that.
In talking about balancing between China and the US, I wonder if you can touch on balancing between China and Russia for India. There was a lot of commentary around that around Putin's visit a couple of weeks ago, and particularly in light of your assertion that countries are now looking more at the rules-based international order and how that protects them against or constrains some of China's moves, particularly in light of Russia and its attitude to the rules-based international order.
Mm-hmm.
I think Razi made an important point about why couldn't Quad powers come to the rescue of Sri Lanka as its next repayment schedule is coming. If we follow that route, I think it will create what economists call moral hazard. Like any country will take debt from China and expect US, India, Japan, and Australia to come to the rescue. Don't think that sounds pretty right. But alternatively, what we can do is, as Pakistan is going to IMF for bailout, and US has something like 16.5% of votes in IMF, India, Japan, Australia have for the 1 or 2% votes. Why can't there be some coordination of these countries in IMF, and then we can work out how this China debt problem is going to be solved for these countries? One. Two, the questions to Jeff. Not only that you've already addressed about the US inconsistencies over time, but what about Mr. Trump? Like, I get the national security strategy. I like that. We like your free and open Indo-Pacific. But we are afraid that Mr. Trump can just rise up one day and say something and wipe out everything. He can just tweet out something and everything will come to zero. And when Katsa question was put to him recently, he said India will find out soon, as if he was uttering a dialogue from a spy thriller.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, I think I thought about that particular aspect as to if any of the Indo-Pacific countries came out to bail out Sri Lanka or any other country that is faced with this whole debt repayment issue. It's more of you're kind of free riding essentially the Chinese loans. But at the same time, think about the strategic costs associated with it and what you might be gaining. Would you want to push countries into the Chinese way even more? Or would you but I agree with I like your idea of making some taking some coordinated steps within multilateral institutions such as the IMF also. That's also doable, but I think some of the Indo-Pacific countries could also come up to offer some assistance and this thing. I don't think we need to be too caught up in I think the strategic benefits, I think outweigh the losses in a sense. Thank you.
So to address some of the questions, a very good question. And the way I kind of conceptualize what you were asking is, in a way, is China recognize that this is happening, and is it taking its own measures to either do its own balancing or to mitigate the effects of the balancing that it does see happening? And the answer is not really. It should be. If you were sitting in Beijing, you would think the one thing most likely to undermine your ambitions is to get all the countries in your periphery to join up against you, to be afraid of what's happening and to band together with each other, with the United States, to join up against you. So you would think that the imperative would be to do whatever you could to assure that these countries weren't going in that direction, to assuage some of their fears and their concerns, to extend an olive branch. And while China has spent a lot of money conducting diplomacy in the region and winning over friends and local rulers who benefit from China's largesse, it has not really changed its behavior to assuage their concerns. In fact, its behavior has only grown more assertive. And I think India, in some ways, is the perfect microcosm of this phenomenon. And in many ways, the one country China should be most concerned about moving in America's direction. You would think it would have done everything in its power to prevent that from happening. And there's even low-hanging fruit that China could pursue to win India over, to prove that it's a friend, that it has trust and long-term intentions. The border dispute, what interest does China have in keeping this open and flaming and in engendering resentment among a generation of Indians who are going to be ruling the country eventually? I mean, they know nothing but conflict with China and hostility. The relationship with Pakistan. Why are you blocking sanctions on global terrorists residing inside Pakistan? What benefit does that bring to you at a time where you're locking up 1 million Uyghurs and re-educating them in camps? These are minor steps that China could take that I think would go some way toward engendering goodwill in India that it just seems incapable of or unwilling to take. There are smaller examples with Japan, with the Philippines, with Vietnam, and others. But I think it's consistently proven unwilling to move on these issues. It will give money, and it will be a good friend to local governments that are friendly to it. But in terms of addressing national interests and national security concerns, it hasn't really done that. President Trump could sort of change everything with the snap of the finger. The president in the U.S. system is very powerful, but the broad trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, in my opinion, does not change easily, and I don't necessarily think that this president has upended that. He has certainly done things differently than the Democratic administration would have done or even another Republican would have done. But if you looked at all of our partnerships and friendships and alliances before President Trump was elected and you look at them now, the optics change. How we talk about what the media focuses on, what this leader said, what this leader wore, what this person tweeted. But if you look at the fundamentals of the relationship, in many cases, they've remained the same. You know, the U.S. foreign policy establishment is very wide and very deep and is not just the president, is not just the Secretary of State, is not just the assistant secretaries, is not just the military, PACOM and CENTCOM, is not just the Foreign Affairs Committee in the U.S., is not just the Armed Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, Congress, the executive branch, the military, the think tank establishment, the intelligence community. It is a giant ship, and it doesn't move so easily to a completely different course, even with the snap of the fingers of the president. So, if anything, despite all of the change, I think when historians look back, they will find more continuity in U.S. foreign policy than dramatic change, though we can sort of debate the specifics about any particular policy area. And the last question was about Russia. I don't have too much to add on that. Russia was not a subject of the book, but certainly their partnership with China is a relatively new development. China and Russia have historically been viewed as rivals. And over the past 10 years, they've formed, I think, a tactical partnership that some may have underestimated to a degree. I still think that over the long term, their interests diverge, and there's not a tremendous amount of solid foundation to this partnership. It's more of a transactional partnership that's convenient for both sides. There remains a lot of distrust in each country toward the other, and their alignment of interests is unlikely to remain as strong or go stronger over the course of time. Having said that, it has proven a more enduring partnership than some believed, and it's one that has changed the geopolitical balance of power marginally. I think it matters for India maybe more than anyone else. India has watched as its closest partner and patron, major geopolitical patron, that there's been a drift in that relationship. And not only has Russia moved closer to its closest potential existential threat, China, but even toward Pakistan. From almost zero relationship during the Cold War and afterward, just in the past few years, we've seen Russian military and intelligence officers in Pakistan talking about potentially joining CPEC, doing joint military exercises, potentially even It was rumored that they would do one in Kashmir at one time. This remains low level, but starting from a base of almost zero is significant.
Well, I think we have one final round, time for one final round of questions. We have, I think, 3 questions. So.
You have to get him.
Thank you. You know, Jeff, you'd like to just consider, putting yourself in the shoes of these little countries which surround or are around China in Asia. Most of the countries in Asia, these smaller ones, have a common land border or a maritime border with China. And they find this reality of a large China very different from what you perceive it as from a distant. So they take it as, their interest, therefore, would be to appease China rather than to confront it in any way. So I find that most of these countries are going to be in a neutral zone and not appear to be confronting China. And if there is any confrontation between the US and China, these are going to be neutral or even pro towards the Chinese. So sometimes I feel that this balancing and these strategies that are formulated in the West are more suiting to geopolitics and geostrategy at a level which is not applicable in this region. And in this region, it is that they see a reality which is that appease China, and that is in their interest. And so you may feel it's a desire of the West, but it is not a necessity for these people to do that. And, from the Shangri-La dialogue, it's there in my editorial for this magazine that I edit, Indian Defense Review. I seen that very deliberately. And I find that in the speech, the Prime Minister had literally avoided leadership of the Indo-Pacific that was being thrust upon him. India is very reluctant. I can imagine a little picture where there's a person, you pushing him onto a stage from the wings of a stage, and he doesn't want to go onto the center stage, and you're literally pushing him and say, you take charge now. He doesn't want to, and that's what India is. Don't want to take charge. And militarily, we are not in a state to take charge because we are in a situation where China was many years ago when they had to come up with this, that hide and bide. We are still building up, and we need to hide and bide before we can take charge and confront anything that comes in our way. Thank you.
Come on up. Jeff, thanks for a wonderful presentation. I want to put to you a proposition, and I want you to sort of respond to this. This is a narrative that was quite popular in the wake of the Shangri-La dialogue a few months back, which is that what we saw at Shangri-La was not one but 3 different versions or interpretations of the Indo-Pacific, what you call free and open Indo-Pacific. The Indian model seemed to be the more conciliatory model, which was work with everyone, consider this to be a broad sort of arc of interests, arc of prosperity, carry everyone along, don't contain China, don't contain anyone, everyone's a part of this. The second narrative that we got to hear was the narrative that was presented by Secretary Mattis, which was more a confrontational narrative, which was to say that the free and open Indo-Pacific was not so much about the Indo-Pacific, but the free and open rules that undergird the system. And he was directly calling out China's aggression in the South China Sea, its operations in the Indian Ocean, the debt traps, the dependencies, etc. He was trying to confront China for the wrongs that it had done. The third model that we got to see was very interesting, at least from our perspective, was the model that was presented by ASEAN, and I talk about the foreign minister of Indonesia. And there, the sort of understanding that we had was that this is essentially the Asia-Pacific plus. It is still the Asia-Pacific. ASEAN still plays a really important role in the region. And this is a consociational model in which we will share authority and we will share responsibility, and China will be a part of the system because China has been a big partner in the region. There's no way you can divorce China from this. Now, the trouble is that these 3 different versions do seem to have some overlaps, but there are major dissonances. And has the US thought about the fact that its particular interpretation or conception of the Indo-Pacific isn't quite in sync with the way ASEAN looks at it and India looks at it, which is why India is not so enthusiastic about the Quad. Will all of this turn out to be a problem as we go into the future? Because with the US, we need a partnership going, and we need to be clear in terms of how we look at these big concepts. Thanks.
We have two more questions, I think, very brief. Keshav and Pat.
Thank you for your remarks, Jeff. I just had a quick question about the ongoing US-China trade war. What merit is there to the argument that the trade war has less to do about addressing the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China and more about dislodging existing supply and value chains that have linked the two economies together? Basically trying to find the strategic rationale behind that. Thank you.
I have no idea. I can answer that one right away. I don't do any economics in really any capacity, so I wouldn't be prepared to answer that question. But it's a good one.
Thanks.
No, it's just this is just a comment. I mean, she spoke about what the Chinese were doing in response to the moves made by China's immediate neighbors and by the US and things like that. The point is that the Chinese actually have become very strategically autistic, as Edward Luckbart put it. So they become sort of impervious to what others really think about them and about their conduct. And I think that's the real reason why we see a certain assertiveness that has been rather enduring. And it's become a very reactionary state. And that's the reason why you will continue to see tension. Potentially, you will start to see more balancing by many of the countries around China's periphery down the line, which would be perhaps more robust than what it is right now. But it is really a product of strategic autism.
Okay, final comments, Jim.
Well, I've heard that term before, and it's not terribly politically correct, so I try not to use it, but I think it does at least encapsulate the idea that China has difficulty seeing how it's perceived by others, that Chinese leaders do. They can't quite understand why you don't get why our plan works for you. If you simply fall in line and are sensitive to our priorities and do things the way we want you to, this will be very prosperous for you. You know, this would be, and they don't seem to get that other capitals have some pride and some sovereignty and want to enjoy make their own choices and be autonomous. And not everything has to be about falling in line with China's preferences. So I think that term does encapsulate an important phenomenon. The balancing among the regional states. That you're 100% right, and I think and hope that I accurately covered that in the book, that many regional countries, particularly the smaller capitals, particularly the ASEANs, do not want to have to make a choice between the US and China. In fact, going back to a previous point, sometimes enjoy having the choice and enjoy playing them off each other. If you don't do X for us, we're going to go ask Beijing. If you don't do Y for us, we're going to go back to Washington. And they play this game to good effect and get material benefit out of it. The one place I probably don't agree is where you said they prefer to stay neutral, maybe even some are pro-China. The reality is the vast majority of them say, we would like to have a balance between the powers. A relative balance of power. We don't need the balance to be in favor of the Quad or the freedom democracies. We would prefer to be, but if there's not a balance, and if there has to be one country relatively dominant here, we're actually very clear on who we prefer. We know the United States. You've been around for decades. You've assured the regional order and regional security. We know you don't have any territorial designs on us. We know your economic principles. So we prefer to stay out of this fight. We prefer that if there is going to be a fight, it stays relatively even. But if there has to be one country in control, we're actually pretty clear on who we want that to be. And there was just a poll out, I think, in the last few days asking several Indo-Pacific populations, which country, if one has to be in a leadership role, which do you prefer? It was around 73% US, 22% China, if I'm not mistaken. And that's actually fairly consistent, been consistent over the years. But again, your point is right. If given the option, they don't want to choose. Three visions, Abhijit. I don't know that I saw those visions as opposite or in conflict. I saw them as different points of emphasis, particularly with the U.S. and India. There was definitely a difference in tone, particularly on the American side, although that may be more of a reflection of a change in the U.S. More than any other administration, the Trump administration has come out very firmly and spoken about China in a return to great power competition as a strategic competitor and a strategic rival. From the national security strategy to statements from senior government officials, they have been much, much more candid about speaking openly, publicly, and directly about what they see as challenges and threats from China. That was much less the case during the Obama administration, during the Bush administration. It's certainly not India's tradition or many Indo-Pacific capitals' tradition to use these forums to come out with public challenges and tirades against other Indo-Pacific leaders. That's just traditionally not been the culture. So I was less surprised to see that Prime Minister Modi didn't come at China hard at the Shangri-La dialogue. I didn't expect him to. Would we have liked some more forceful statements? Yes. But what matters to me is that in both of them, when they outlined what they want the principles to govern the region are, they were in almost uniform alignment. It was just a difference on emphasis. The ASEAN, credit to our friends in ASEAN and others, ASEAN centrality was not mentioned very much at all in the beginning as a key part of the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Over the last 6 months, it has made its way in, and you've seen Secretary Pompeo's and others stress recently, ASEAN centrality remains a critical component of our regional strategy. So, that's come back into the fold, and I think is a place where U.S. and India agree. The ASEAN centrality is an important component of the strategy. Thank you.
Not that I wish to disagree or oppose Jeff, but I think I have a slightly different take on the whole Russia-China question, because I think you said you have seen some sort of a tactical arrangement between Russia and China in the last 10 years. I would say that it's been more than that, more than a decade. And the initial, maybe first 10 years may have been more of a, or even 7, 8 years, have been more of a tactical arrangement. But last 5 years have seen something more serious taking place in the relationship. It's gaining a lot more strategic weight. And that has come in the wake of the Ukraine crisis and the economic sanctions and the Russia's general sense of isolation in the international community. So therefore, they feel that they need a strong voice on their side, and which comes from China. And therefore, what you see today, this is not to suggest that there is no wariness about the Chinese factor and the Chinese growing power and what it means to them and so on and so forth. So I think that tactical arrangement has moved away, shifted to something more strategic in the last 5 years, I would think. Second, two quick points. About the Indo-Pacific, I think regional connectivity infrastructure projects are key. I am absolutely clear about the need for a strategic understanding and the alignment of interests among the major powers, but at the same time, smaller countries especially need to be given alternatives, and that has to come especially in regional connectivity, economic linkages, and infrastructure projects. Indo-Pacific Business Forum has already started taking some initiatives in this regard. Small sum money has been allocated, and India and Japan are also pulling in some money, but I think that fund has to really increase in a big way so that we can, this Indo-Pacific grouping can give more allocation to other countries. The last quick point on the whole, the Quad and the election year, I think the Quad and the Wuhan summit, all of that, where do I see and why is this playing out? I think this has to be kept in the Indian election context. I think the fact that there is going to be an election in less than in under 6 months or 8 months' time, and India clearly does not want a Doklam-like crisis to happen. And I think practically that was the idea, one of the main ideas behind the Wuhan summit, to avoid any frictions during this 1 year. But at the same time, I think there was a senior level officials Quad meeting that happened in Singapore in June. But again, India did not seem too excited about the Quad concept there. It was somewhat, my sense was that it was lukewarm out there to the whole concept of Quad. Again, that falls into the election campaign rhetoric and the kind of play India wants to give to this concept, because in the Indian election context, I think it is still kind of popular to take somewhat anti-West, anti-US kind of stand, and you don't want to be seen as ganging up as part of the Quad and kind of things. So I think it's somewhat popular to take a stand that is, okay, we are multi-aligned, we are with everybody, we are not ganging up with one country against. I think that will go still very well
Can
in
I ask
the
a
election
question?
context. Yes, please.
Just a legitimate question to you, because I've been hearing this for so long, that it's popular politically to take an anti-U.S. stand, or that it's risky politically to be seen as too pro-U.S. What political leaders have fallen or paid a dear, costly price for being seen as too pro-American? I mean, Prime Minister Modi called America a natural ally on the campaign trail. What terrible political price did he pay for that? In poll after poll, Indians consistently are more pro-American than almost any other Indo-Pacific country. Their at least dislike of America is lower than any other Indo-Pacific country. So where does this myth come from that if we're seen as too pro-American in public, we're going to pay a political price and we have to distance ourselves from the U.S.? I've heard it from political pundits on TV. But I've never seen real evidence to support.
I think there are still pockets within Indian states where you are taking it's a political risk. Let me put it that way. It's a political risk. Second, especially at a time when there are internal political troubles, whether it is some scam or things of that kind, and the Rafale deal currently is going through quite a bit of storm out here within the Indian political thing. I think it's for the political parties to take a safer bet and say, we are multi-aligned, we are with everybody, we are not ganging up against it. We are with China, we play good with Russia, we play with the US, we have everybody on board. We are not aligning one way or the other. I think that's a safer thing for most political parties, especially when there are internal political issues before an election year, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to intervene. It was also evident during the Indo-US.
Yes. I think we have reached the very end of our time, and I think this is something that we can discuss over tea. So thank you. All that's left for me is to thank the partners, Jeff and Raji, and thank you all for having me.